All right. Well, for everyone that is here right now, I'd like to welcome you all for joining us for our SMA INSS PRISM panel discussion entitled How to Engage with China. And I'd also like to thank today's panelists, Dr. Anna Ashton, Dr. Rachel Odell, and Dr. Corey Schake for taking the time to speak with us today. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the discussion. So during our panelist comments or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions through Zoom Gov's chat function. It's a chat icon and it's at the bottom of your screen. Please also submit all of your questions to Todd Beasy. The questions that aren't going to be submitted to Todd specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send your questions to Todd. Also note that your name will appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address your question. But if you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, you can go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen and then more next to your name, and finally rename. So today we unfortunately don't have a voting function at the moment, but we hope to have one soon for the Q&A. But regardless, we will be addressing your questions and make sure to send them to Todd. So now I'm going to briefly turn the floor over to today's moderator, Mr. Michael McCloudzik, to kick things off. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, everybody, wherever you might be. And welcome to the Institute for National Strategic Studies Speaker Series, organized in collaboration with the Strategic Multilayer Assessment. This series of distinguished speakers seeks to tease out the most vexing emerging challenges to our national security, focusing this year specifically on great power competition, geoeconomics, and technological innovation. Although there's a growing consensus in the United States on the adversarial relationship with China, opinions on how to engage with China or to disengage with China are diverse. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the US-China relationship will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. But is this really a viable approach, or is it naive? Some insist that we're already at war with China, but a war that we in the United States don't recognize as war because it doesn't involve combat operations. Others argue that we should decouple our economy from China, or at least achieve supply chain autonomy for strategic industries. And yet others counter-argue that the global economy is too interdependent for decoupling, and that trying to do so would entail dramatic economic losses. Our distinguished panel today will provide insight into these issues from three different perspectives. Dr. Anna Ashton is Vice President for Government Affairs at the U.S.-China Business Council. Ms. Rachel Odell is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, and Dr. Corey Schake is Director of Foreign and Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Each will speak for 15 minutes, after which we will open up the floor for an audience-driven discussion and questions and answers to close out the session promptly at 12:59. With that, is the panel ready? Okay, then Dr. Ashton, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much. And I just feel like I have to correct the record. In fairness to my colleagues on here, I'm probably the only one who's not a doctor. I'm a JD, but not a doctor. So thank you for having us. I'm excited and looking forward to sharing our different perspectives and hearing from others on the panel their thoughts on the broader issues in the relationship, and also the perspective that I'm bringing. So just to introduce myself again, I'm Anna Ashton. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at the US-China Business Council, which is a trade association that represents US companies with business in China. We have about 250 member companies right now. The vast majority of them are American multinationals with brand names that you would recognize that have been in the China market for 20 plus years. So it's a significant part of their global business. In many cases, it's one of the top 5 markets for them, if not one of the top 3 markets for them. From their perspective, being in China and being successful in China is necessary to their long-term competitiveness globally. And so we look at ourselves as having a mission of advocating on behalf of our member companies' interests, and also on behalf of the US economy more broadly. In my government affairs role, I engage with policymakers in both the legislative and executive branches of government to explain the business community perspectives on the relationship in general, as well as the implications of particular policy proposals. When my lobbying hat is on, I also spend time advocating for or against certain actions or language in bills and executive orders. There's plenty to do with the executive branch for sure. And certainly the Trump administration kept us very busy on that side, especially in 2020, as we had a flurry of executive orders that came out, from the Internet and Telecommunications Supply Chain Executive Order, or the ICTS Supply Chain Executive Order, to the WeChat and TikTok executive orders, the EO preventing investments in communist Chinese military companies, which then prompted a flurry of developments in terms of which companies precisely those were, and on and on. But in the last couple of years, we've been increasingly busy with legislative actions. Historically, China has not been a big focus of legislation, but in the current highly divided, gridlocked political climate that we're in, China has become the exception, sort of the issue upon which most lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, can agree. As a result, we've been seeing an unprecedented volume of legislative proposals that are either focused on China or have a significant China angle, or simply invoke China. And many of these proposals have significant business implications for the short and long term. In the last Congress, the 116th Congress, there were more than 550 China-related bills and resolutions that were introduced, according to our tracking. And in the current Congress, which kicked off in late January of this year, we've already seen about 216 China-related proposals, many of them introduced or sponsored by members of both parties. To put this prolific bipartisan activity in perspective for myself, I went back and I took a look at legislation that dealt with terrorism in the wake of September 11th, 2001. In that Congress, the 107th Congress, there was very strong bipartisan support for efforts to attack again. And Congress overwhelmingly passed some sweeping legislation in bipartisan fashion with significant ramifications. And yet, the total number of terror-related proposals introduced during that Congress was just 130. So 130 proposals to address terrorism in the wake of 9/11 versus more than 550 proposals to address various perceived threats and challenges emanating from China in 2019 and 2020. And already more than 200 proposals in the first 6 months of this new Congress. That really underscores the China zeitgeist in Washington, from my perspective. By that measure, you could say that the sense of China is a menace among members of Congress right now would seem to far exceed the sense of Al-Qaeda as a menace in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. That's not the only lens through which to look at this, and I think it's important to give some different context, a different lens, in order to be completely fair and balanced. China legislation should also be viewed in the context of the totality of Congress's work. There were 16,000 bills and resolutions, give or take, that were introduced in the last Congress in 2019 and 2020. And as is typically the case, only a fraction of those, 344 of them to be precise, became law. And of the 344 that became law, only 15 were China related. And while we have an awful lot of China related proposals already circulating in this Congress, more than 200, they too are just a fraction of well over 5,000 or so bills and resolutions that have been introduced since January. But even with that being said, China is, and I know that everyone here knows this, but China is a real hot button issue. There's no doubt about that. And it's been a very eventful few weeks in the Senate, and now we're turning to the Hill to see what happens on that side of the legislative process. Even things that aren't necessarily really about China, as I mentioned before, can be about China, especially on the Hill these days, and especially in efforts to invoke and rally bipartisan support for almost anything. In a recent podcast for the New York Times, David Sanger said, if there's one key lesson that emerges from really the non-debate over this bill, and he was referring to Schumer's China package that recently passed the Senate, he said, it's that America needs again, as it always has, an adversary to be the organizing thought for things we probably needed to do anyway. And then his interviewer asked, that's how America gets its act together? And he replied, that's how America has a shot at getting its act together. Similarly, we also recently were told in a meeting with executive branch officials that bipartisanship, from their perspective, is absolutely critical in order to move the country forward and strengthen the country's ability to address our challenges and remain competitive into and through the rest of the 21st century, but that the only bipartisanship possible right now is the kind that is focused outward. So, China. I wanted to quickly talk a little bit about what's happened recently in Congress and give you a few thoughts on the priorities from the business community's perspective, things that they are watching to do with the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act in particular. And then I want to turn it over to colleagues, and I'm happy to talk about other things that we're watching that the business community cares about. But there's so much that I don't think that I could barely cover it if I tried to give an overview of all of it. So I'll focus on what has happened most recently, which was Senate passage of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. It was in this context of needing to rally bipartisan support around the one thing that can draw strong bipartisan support, which is China and concerns about China, that earlier this month, the Senate passed USICA by a margin of 68 to 32. 19 Republicans voted in favor of the bill, a clear sign of bipartisan support as it headed to the House for further consideration, but actually not quite as overwhelming as had been the goal. We were long told by both sides of the aisle that the aim was to get at least 70 votes in order to increase the odds that the House would move the bill straight to the floor. And at this point, that seems somewhat unlikely. The House has its own sweeping proposals, and it doesn't appear to be ready to rubber stamp the Senate's work on this. Only one lawmaker from the left, Senator Bernie Sanders, voted against this bill, which is actually a reflection of a burgeoning dissent among the progressive left. And I have a couple more comments on that in a minute, and I imagine Rachel might too. President Joe Biden applauded the bipartisan vote in the Senate this week, or a couple weeks ago, pointing out that high-tech research and development proposals in the bill mirror his American Innovation Plan and his American Jobs Plan. Biden's statement didn't mention China, but it invoked the China challenge indirectly, noting that the US is in competition to lead the 21st century and must maintain its position as other countries invest in their own high-tech R&D capabilities. The final version of USICA stands at 2,376 pages and contains many provisions that implicate the US-China commercial relationship, and we are honestly still working through it to fully understand what all of the implications might be. The final bill that passed the Senate included an amendment in the nature of a substitute that Schumer filed in mid-May, and then 8 more amendments that made it in via voice vote or roll call votes on the floor over the course of the following weeks. There were more than 600 amendments that were proposed, so lots and lots of interest in ensuring that various specific China provisions were at least considered. And I'm sure that those that weren't considered, we're going to see introduced in other packages and other bills throughout the rest of this Congress. There were several notable provisions that, from our perspective, we were watching closely and that didn't make it into the bill. One was an amendment by Senators Bob Casey and John Cornyn, so Democrat from PA and Republican from Texas, which would have created a national critical capabilities review mechanism. In other words, an outbound investment review mechanism, similar to what we have with inbound investment and the CFIUS review process. Then Senators Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown had an Eliminating Global Market Distortions to Protect American Jobs Act, which they introduced as an amendment that would have expanded trade remedy powers and made it much easier to wield tariffs as a tool for managing the commercial relationship. From the business perspective, that would have been a negative thing because we haven't felt the tariffs have been particularly effective so far, except in the sense that they have hurt US business interests and US workers. An amendment from Senator John Cornyn would have struck language that has been very controversial from Republicans in the Endless Frontier Act section of the bill, which requires paying a prevailing wage rate in whatever part of the country where there is a project going on that receives federal funding related to Endless Frontiers. So the research and development funding that was the foundation for the bill. And then arguably, from our perspective, the most positive amendment that did make it in was one from Senator Mike Crapo, the ranking member of Senate Finance, who fought hard to ensure that the committee's bipartisan language was ultimately included in the package. It was originally left out. And that amendment, the Trade Act of 2021, it includes provisions that would restart the Section 301 tariff exclusion process, very important for companies that have been hurt by tariffs in both directions. It would renew previously granted exclusions, and it would also renew other tariff-related measures, tariff relief-related measures. The Senate's final bill also included an amendment by Senator Steve Daines, which would direct the executive branch to take additional steps on China's intellectual property practices, which is something that the business community absolutely does want to see the administration hold China accountable to. And it would have teed up the potential negotiation of a phase 2 agreement. Phase 1 expires basically at the end of this year. And now the action moves to the House. So we understand that the House is going to be taking up legislation soon. They've got a busy calendar this week. They have their own version of sorts of USICA, the Eagle Act, introduced by House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Meeks. It's not exactly the same in some ways. We understand that it's facing resistance from Republicans for being a little bit softer in its language on Taiwan and certain other aspects of the security relationship. At the same time, it's got tougher language from a business community perspective on things like how to address forced labor concerns and what the government's responsibility versus the business community's responsibility will be in those efforts. We have heard that there's interest from members in the House in blue slipping the bill, which is to say there are those in the House who believe that the bill oversteps constitutionally mandated limits that require that any legislation that is
Ms. Ashton, I think that you've frozen.
So we seem to be having a Zoom moment. Can we text her and let her know that she's on freeze?
Yes, I can. She was getting close to the end of her remarks, correct, though? If we want to, yeah, it looks like she dropped off, so she'll probably be coming back in. So, Michael, I'll leave it to you now.
Okay.
To continue the discussion.
We can give her an alibi when she gets back online. Ms. Odell, can we move over to you now?
Yes, yeah, happy to follow on to Anna's remarks and look forward to hearing the rest of them when she's back on. But I think that mine will be a complement to hers, and that I'll be zooming out somewhat to look at a bigger strategic picture, and somewhat more at some of the security issues involved, whereas she's focused on some of the domestic political trends in the United States and in China policy, and more on the economic technological side. So I'm hopefully it will dovetail well. And as has already been noted, I'm a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a new think tank that was founded in late 2019 that aims to reduce the militarization of U.S. foreign policy and promote a grand strategy of military restraint, but robust diplomatic and economic engagement with the world. So in January, in the East Asia program, I issued with my colleagues Michael Swain and Jessica Lee a report on a new U.S. strategy in East Asia, and some of my remarks today will reflect some of the recommendations that we issued in that report. So what we argue is that the world is facing twin crises, a global pandemic and rising climate chaos, even as an epochal change in the balance of power is unfolding in the Asia-Pacific region. In response to these trends, the United States in recent years and continuing under the Biden administration is doubling down on efforts to contain a rising China and maintain its eroding military dominance in the region. Simultaneously, the United States, despite Biden's effort to re-engage in the region, I argue, is continuing in many ways to neglect broad-based economic engagement and diplomatic cooperation with Asian nations. It's alienating nations around the world, especially in East Asia, by asking them to choose sides in a so-called great power competition between Washington and Beijing, even while its diplomatic and economic engagement in the region drifts. The Biden administration is thus far largely maintaining the Trump administration's zero-sum approach toward China, which is driving a security dilemma with Beijing and confirming China's worst fears about America's supposed intention to contain and weaken China. It's also endangering US vital interests and mutually beneficial economic exchange and bilateral cooperation with China to combat climate change, to combat the pandemic, and to promote broader global prosperity in both the United States and China and beyond. On the military side, the United States is still seeking to maintain overwhelming control of the seas up to China's coast, and some of the operational strategies that have been proposed to this end risk leading to early escalation in a conflict, including potential nuclear war. Nor is it clear that such strategies will succeed, as the changing nature of warfare in recent decades has made dominance prohibitively costly. At the same time, it would be a mistake to respond to these circumstances by completely withdrawing US forces from the Western Pacific or allowing China to establish an exclusive sphere of influence in East Asia. Although the United States can significantly reduce its military presence in the Middle East and Europe without endangering vital US interests, East Asia is a somewhat different story. The countries in the region have complex relationships characterized not only by deep economic integration, but also by historical animosities and unresolved maritime and territorial disputes. America's deep military engagement in the region since the end of World War II and the Korean War has also made countries in the region, especially US allies, heavily dependent on the US military presence for preserving stability. Major US military disengagement from East Asia, while possible and even desirable over the long term, would under current circumstances be likely to trigger arms races, nuclear proliferation, and possibly conflicts between the two Koreas, between Beijing and Taipei, and over disputes regarding maritime sovereignty issues. Not only would such conflict cause great suffering to the peoples of East Asia and risk dragging the United States into a war, it would also directly endanger many of America's other vital interests in the region: cooperation on climate change, pandemics, free flow of commerce, robust trade and investment, some of the things I mentioned earlier. Moreover, China's rise as a military power raises some legitimate concerns in the region, not least among US allies, and poses some danger to US interests. Short of the use of force, unbalanced Chinese military power could further embolden Beijing to coerce other nations through economic or diplomatic pressure, while weakening those nations' resolve to resist such coercion. Beijing could apply such coercion in ways that could interfere with US interests and objectives in the region. Additionally, though China's capabilities and strategy today are generally not oriented toward conquest outside of the context of Taiwan, its intentions could evolve over time. A more complete military disengagement from the region could hobble America's ability to re-engage militarily in East Asia in time to respond to such an adverse development. So instead, to protect American interests in East Asia and beyond, the US needs a transformed strategy that bolsters America's engagement in the region, especially economically and diplomatically, while rejecting an effort to restore all aspects of military dominance. This strategy must rebalance America's policies to rely more on economic and diplomatic tools than military means, and should really prioritize deepening those economic and diplomatic engagement as the most effective defense against the paramount threats to US national security, such as climate change and pandemics. Shifting America's priorities in this way will require a strong but transformed military presence in Asia to maintain a balance of power with China and to help US allies defend themselves from coercion or attack. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like later. But Washington also must recognize that both the United States and its allies have an interest in improving the tenor of relations with China and ultimately integrating Beijing into inclusive economic and cooperative security mechanisms at both the global and regional levels. Accordingly, Washington should redirect its bilateral security alliances, as well as its alliance with European countries in NATO, away from a singular focus on countering China to a mixed set of goals encompassing not only denial-oriented deterrence, but also threat reduction and confidence-building measures. It should deepen its engagement in broader regional economic and political institutions and facilitate cooperative regional initiatives to deal with common security threats like climate change and pandemics. Washington should also engage in direct negotiations with China and other involved parties to reduce military tensions and arms races over Taiwan and maritime disputes. And in addition, it should continue to pursue the creation of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, which will require extensive cooperation and negotiation with China, in addition to, of course, South and North Korea and other countries in the region. So this new strategy, centered on robust diplomatic engagement and military restraint, is essential to protect America's interests. We argue that it entails a more responsible version of statecraft in the East Asian region and around the world, and it'd be better than perpetuating a failed status quo approach or the more aggressive approach that many in Washington are advocating. We continue to move in that direction, and to be better at addressing the region's radically changing political, economic, and security environment. So now I'm just going to touch upon some specific examples of this in three overarching areas. So these three areas, the first is to reprioritize diplomatic engagement and economic integration. The second is to pursue a more stable military balance with China and peace on the Korean Peninsula. And the third is to bolster US influence and appeal through reforms at home and abroad. So in this first category of reprioritizing our diplomatic engagement and economic integration in the region and elsewhere, I would argue that some of the specific things the United States needs to do are to emphasize more inclusive regional diplomacy and cooperative security. Right now, the United States is putting a heavy emphasis on engaging through the quadrilateral security dialogue with Japan, India, and Australia. While I think that's a positive institution in many ways that can help facilitate cooperation among these nations to serve shared interests, I think that it's making a lot of countries in Asia nervous because it seems like somewhat of an exclusive club, even though the United States and the others deny that that's the case. Since it's oriented as a containment mechanism towards China or as a competitive institution vis-a-vis China, many countries in the region, including US allies like South Korea, are not comfortable with joining the Quad as it stands. And also ASEAN, the nations of Southeast Asia, are very concerned that the Quad is perhaps seeking to displace ASEAN centrality, which has long been the sort of focus of regional institutionalism. So I'd argue that the United States needs to re-engage in ASEAN in particular, in addition to the Quad, to re-engage in the wide range of ASEAN initiatives. Of course, we are still engaged in them, but we really need to increase our emphasis there. Even though there will be certain frustrations, ASEAN's not the panacea for resolving all regional problems. It's a really important venue for engagement. And the United States needs to up our game there, not only with a couple of countries that we feel sort of most aligned with on a more zero-sum approach to China. And actually, we should be welcoming positive relations between China and other Asian countries and promoting inclusive multilateralism to coordinate action on shared interests and resolve disputes. We should work with countries throughout the region, including our allies, China, and other East Asian nations, to jointly develop a cooperative agenda for addressing issues of mutual concern, such as climate change, pandemics, financial instability, maritime insecurity, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. This is the kind of agenda that countries in the region really want the United States to be engaged to help promote. And they recognize that real progress on these issues can't be made without the United States and China working together with them to promote these, to promote that progress. We should be also engaging economically in the region, and this requires us to really move ourselves into a position where we could rejoin the CPTPP and potentially even join RCEP. These are two broad-based regional agreements. Right now, that's a very tall order at a domestic political level, but we argue that we really need to bolster, to change the way that we approach trade policy at a domestic level by ensuring that the gains from trade are shared and distributed in a more equitable and fair way through major domestic policy investments, such as some of those that have been proposed in the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that Anna was discussing earlier, in research and development, or in some of the other proposals that have been issued in investments in infrastructure and in healthcare and education, and that these kinds of investments can be ways to capture the gains from trade if those are more explicitly tied together, because trade does overall grow our economy, but sometimes in inequitable ways. And so this would be a way to rebuild political support for trade, which public opinion polling still shows that Americans like trade deals. They just want them to be fair. So we need to make sure that we're negotiating fair deals with China and with other nations, but we shouldn't back away from that trade. And also for strategic reasons, we really need to be engaging in trade in Asia, and that's really where the center of gravity in this competition with China lies, is in the economic domain. And that thinking of things in terms of containment or military competition is really pretty futile from the perspective of countries in this region that depend on China economically. So that's where we need to be engaging more in order to pursue positive sum cooperation, but also to give countries outside options so that if they ever are subject to Chinese coercion, they have other places to go, such as to the U.S. economy to protect themselves from that. Now, in the second category of pursuing a more stable military balance, I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll describe a little bit more what we mean by this. First of all, we argue that the United States should restructure U.S. alliances and force posture in East Asia around a defense strategy of denial rather than control. So we shouldn't be seeking dominance in the waters and airspace of the Western Pacific anymore. It's unrealistic and destabilizing, and also would be really expensive. We should instead work with allies to implement a smarter approach to balancing China's growing power that's centered on denying Chinese control over those spaces and denying potential Chinese aggression. And this new denial strategy should be built on the enhanced defense capabilities of allies in particular, but working in tighter coordination with more dispersed US forces that are playing a more supporting role to allied efforts. This will entail and can entail a significant reduction in forward US ground troops that wouldn't be particularly relevant to most US-China contingencies, and greater reliance on smaller surface ships, submarines, more agile and resilient air forces, hardening of bases throughout the region, and that these kinds of investments, as well as similar investments by our allies and by Taiwan and sort of more porcupine defense strategies, that those don't require major military buildups or significant increases in defense spending that seem to be the buzz in Washington. That actually we can maintain that credible deterrence and establish a stable balance of power with a lighter presence that is more sustainable over the longer term. And again, we should couple these with efforts to pursue confidence building measures and crisis management that aims to mitigate tension and potential conflicts rather than exacerbating a security dilemma that makes war more likely. This is particularly the case in the Taiwan Strait, and maybe we can talk more about Taiwan in the future in the Q&A. I'd be happy to do that. But also the case in maritime disputes where we need to reduce the frequency of our freedom of navigation operations and instead pursue more cooperative and inclusive maritime security efforts. And then last, again, I'll just touch upon this need to really bolster our influence and appeal abroad vis-a-vis China, both in China and in other countries around the world, through really making our model be more appealing through reforms at home and abroad, through those kind of investments I mentioned earlier, through changing our approach to human rights promotion to make it less connected explicitly to geopolitical competition, and instead sort of more oriented towards actually trying to create positive change that doesn't just provoke nationalist backlash, and through really making sure that we're protecting human rights domestically, and including for Chinese and Asian Americans who have actually become targets of a lot of racial animus as a result of some of our overheated China rhetoric and policy in recent years. So with that, I will maybe turn it back to Anna for finishing her remarks and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And Corey, if that's okay with you, we had an interruption with Anna. So Anna, if you would like to go ahead and just finish up, then we'll go on to Corey.
Absolutely, and sorry about that. I'm still working from home, and my Citadel-bound teenager tripped over something, unplugged the router, and is horrified at the event that he disrupted. So I think actually some of what I had left to say pairs well with points that Rachel just made. From the business community's perspective, successful competition over the long term actually depends on at least some degree of continued engagement. And that's because of the importance of the China market, both for US companies that are operating there and globally. I like to point out in trying to talk about how the business community sees this, that 80% or more of the our member companies have in China are operations that are to serve either the China market or the regional market in East Asia. They call themselves these days in China for China. They're really not primarily in the business of manufacturing cheaply in China in order to export goods back to the United States. It's not that they aren't exporting goods back to the United States, but that's no longer the way that the relationship is fundamentally characterized. It's not actually cheap enough to manufacture things in China en masse in that way, just for the purpose of selling them more cheaply here. That was the case in 2001, but it's just not anymore. And then when we think about how important the Chinese market is and how important it could be for multinational companies' ability to compete globally, right now, 15% of China's population is middle class. And that 15% of their population is bigger than all of our population. So by the same measurement rubric, our middle class is something like 50% of our population. You can imagine that when China's thriving middle class, growing middle class gets to 50%, it's an enormous, enormous market, even if consumption per capita is lower than it is here. So the potential for that market to drive the global economy is almost hard to comprehend. And particularly if our policies are unilateral and prevent our companies from participating in the market while their competitors from third countries are able to participate in the market, that means that their competitors have an enormous leg up on them, both their third country competitors and their domestic Chinese competitors, which makes it harder for them to amass the profits that are required to continue to push the cutting edge of research and development. Something like 70% or more of research and development funding and activity in the United States these days actually comes from our private sector. So I think also, in the short to medium term, there's the access to resources. There's just the reality that even if there is real reason to diversify supply chains and ensure that we're not overly dependent on China for various inputs in manufacturing processes, we are currently somewhat dependent on China for certain things like rare earths and polysilicon. And that's not something that can be changed overnight, no matter how strong your policy or your funding. So if we're going to disentangle ourselves in certain ways from China and become less dependent on China, it has to be done over a period of time, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't leave us overnight scrambling for resources that we don't yet have other alternatives for. And we have been proposing that policymakers and others in this policy debate think about this not in terms of decoupling, but in terms of what Gwyneth Paltrow calls conscious uncoupling, sort of a recognition that this isn't like the 20th century Soviet Union. We're not in a situation where our potential most significant adversary is someone that we don't have any economic ties to. We're in a situation where we have very deep economic ties to each other, mutual over a very long period of time, as well as some common ground in terms of our fundamental interests and concerns, like addressing climate change. So we may have to recognize that some degree of decoupling is necessary, and that some from on China in various aspects of our economic engagement necessary for national security reasons. But this is more like a divorce where there are kids involved than like a breakup where there aren't any kids involved. We have to keep in mind that our common interests are going to continue to be critically important to us, and the kind of disentanglement that we engage in will affect those common interests and our ability to take care of them now and in the future.
Thank you very much, Anna.
And I'll stop there.
With that, Corey, over to you.
So Anna's description is that the need for some sort of common ground in American domestic politics has driven Republicans and Democrats in the Congress to an anti-China stance. And Rachel's description is that American militarism, a desire for dominance, has driven the United States to an anti-China position. And I think both of these arguments are deficient in two ways. The first way is that they don't acknowledge that China's behavior has changed, and that the rising anti-China tide in the United States is a reaction to China's behavior. American strategy has been largely consistent for the better part of 50 years in encouraging China, since Nixon's opening to China for strategic reasons, through the Clinton administration's admission of China into the World Trade Organization, through the George W. Bush administration's description of a prosperous, powerful China as being in American interests, provided it became a responsible stakeholder in the international order, to the slow, wrenching realization that that is not what the Chinese government wants for itself. And that in fact, we had admitted China into international organizations like the WTO on preferential terms, that is, not requiring them to meet the standards that the rest of us meet in order to win that participation. Because China's a developing country, we believed that the German philosopher Hegel was right, and that as people grow more prosperous, they become more demanding political consumers. And there's a lot of historical evidence to that effect, right? The world's most prosperous countries that are not rich by removing natural resources from their own environment are all politically liberal countries. But there was the growing realization that the Chinese government was not permitting that liberalization, and that in fact, the Chinese people may not want that political liberalization. And therefore, we needed to be more cautious about permitting China to behave, not to follow the rules that the rest of us are following. That is, giving them preferential advantages, preferential access to American markets, preferential participation in international organizations. And so that's one thing. China's behavior has been becoming increasingly repressive at home and increasingly aggressive internationally. They have more than 1 million Chinese Uyghur in concentration camps. They have repudiated their treaty with Great Britain on the treatment of Hong Kong. Just yesterday, they raided the offices of one of the only formerly independent newspapers in Hong Kong. The leadership's all in jail. There are show trials by which thousands of people are convicted en masse without any individual without any individual proof against them. China's threats to Taiwan. China claims that it wants to support international institutions, and yet when the International Adjudication of Maritime Rights organization that's in The Hague found that China was predatory in Philippine national waters, China refused to acknowledge the legitimacy not only of the ruling, but of the institution. And so there has been a slow growing realization that China poses a threat, not just to the United States, but to the international order of rules and institutions that has created so much prosperity and peace in the last 75 years. The second thing Rachel and Anna's descriptions avert their eyes from is that the United States is not the only country that thinks this. This is not the United States provoking a great power competition or unilaterally trying to hold China down. The United States may be an early country to the realization of the threats China poses, but that is the growing position of not only America's friends and allies, but of the majority of countries in East Asia, who, in refutation of Rachel's recommendations, actually want a strong American military presence and strong alliance commitments from the United States to protect them from China, because what they are worried about is China's predatory behavior. One example of what has changed outside the United States is the attitude of Great Britain, right? Which only 6 or 7 years ago took a huge trade delegation to China, and George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, declared that it was going to be a new golden age in Chinese-British relations for exactly the kind of reasons that Anna advocates, right? It's such a tempting market. They're a growing middle class, and the British government believed that any near-term economic difficulties posed by Brexit could be more than made up for in the Chinese market. But what the British government has found is that the Chinese aren't permitting access to its market on terms that would be fair to British companies. And the British censorship of British companies, which Americans have experienced, the NBA has experienced, Hollywood has experienced, are not only prohibiting the exercise of political and economic liberty within China, they are seeking to effect it within our own free societies. And that's what began to change the British government's position. Even just 3 years ago, Britain considered the United States a bully for suggesting that Huawei components shouldn't be built into 5G programs. When the British government said that, all of its national security cabinet opposed the government's judgment. And it was the British national security establishment, because of the behavior of Chinese firms and a receding belief that any Chinese business is genuinely independent of its government, and that its government was stealing intellectual property, conducting espionage through foreign business practices. And again, the head of the FBI, Tim Wray, testified not long ago that the FBI opens a new Chinese espionage case every 10 hours. That of the 5,000 counterintelligence cases that the FBI currently has open, half of them are against Chinese individuals and businesses. The United States isn't the only country that sees a changing and increasing China threat. And the G7 acknowledge this, the NATO allies acknowledge this, countries of East Asia increasingly acknowledge this. And so it's not the United States moving forward to challenge a great power competitor. It's the United States and its allies and other free economies and other free countries increasingly concerned about China's behavior and feeling the need to regrettably change policies that we had hoped would produce a global market of exactly the kind that Anna is advocating for, and that would allow economic integration to substitute for military defenses, exactly as Rachel is arguing. But the reason we can't do that is actually the behavior of China. And so a policy that started out with a generosity of vision towards China, growing powerful and prosperous, has slowly been recalibrated to one where there is a broad bipartisan acceptance that we need to force China to play by the rules because they are not doing so, and we have permitted them not to do so in ways that damage our security and that damage our prosperity. I want to object to one particular phrase that Rachel used, which is that the United States is seeking control of the seas. And that is inaccurate. What the United States is seeking is freedom of passage on the seas, consistent with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And we have ourselves not even ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but we abide by it. China ratified it and does not abide by it. That's the dilemma that we are facing in our policy, and that's what's driving increased security concerns, increased counterintelligence concerns, increased business concerns. As Anna mentioned, the protection of intellectual property is a huge concern among American businesses. And that concern is unique in China, not globally. And so what we need to do is keep a generosity of vision towards China. I agree with that in Rachel's argument. And I very much agree with both Rachel and Anna's views that we need to be more economically engaged, especially in Asia. The tariff charade is just a tax on American businesses and consumers. It does no harm to Chinese businesses. And where we feel the need to penalize Chinese businesses, exactly as Anna suggested, we should do it multilaterally so that we have the cooperation and the market reach of the united front that has emerged because of China's behavior. I guess the last thing that I would say is that the Trump administration's argument for reciprocity, I think, is the right basis for policy. And the United States isn't the only country that's moving in this direction. In fact, we're not even the first mover. Australia is the frontline state that is bearing the brunt of China's aggression. The attempt to subvert members of their parliament by bribery, the attempt to mobilize Chinese Australians as against their own government, the attempt to make universities censor freedom of speech on campus, and the retaliation against Australian businesses that China has taken. Pushing China to behave like a normal international power should be the purpose of our policy, and we should do it with others. And others are doing some really interesting, important things. Rachel mentioned the Quad, and I agree with her that that's a valuable way forward. I loved that they started with vaccine cooperation as a way to use soft power multilaterally to solve the problems that countries are having as a way to make them open to our concerns. I think that's great American foreign policy. But Japan is actually doing a lot more interesting things than the United States is. Japan and India have started an infrastructure investment fund that has labor protections, environmental protections, and transparency of contracts, none of which the Belt and Road projects have. So that's a valuable space for positive competition. Australia and Japan have started a secure supply chains project that they wouldn't let the United States participate in under the Trump administration because they feared that we wouldn't play by the rules. but we should opt into that very quickly. You know, when China cut off rare earths access to Japan during an international dispute over fishing in 2010, the Japanese moved very quickly to solve the problem that Anna raised, which is our reliance on Chinese mining and processing. You know, rare earths actually aren't rare. They're just dispersed and messy to process. And so the mining and processing has migrated out of advanced economies, but we have plenty of rare earths, and the Energy Department and the Defense Department have started subsidizing the opening of mining and processing so that it will be a business proposition for American and allied businesses to get back into the rare earths. We don't need autarky of supply. We just need reliable supply. And I think Anna and I agree with that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Corey. Good, we have controversy here, and I like that. And as much as I'm tempted to offer the mic back to Rachel and to Anna for a response, we have a lot of questions, and I want to respect those people that have called in. So I'm going to first encourage people to type in any questions to Todd Veazey, and then he's sending them over to me. And I'm going to start with a question from Chintamani Mahapatra, a colleague, and I'm going to start with Chintamani because I know that it's coming from Delhi, India, and it's very late over there. And the question is to Corey and to Rachel: how should the US handle China claiming sovereignty over 90% of the waters and islands in the South China Sea? And if we can start with you, Rachel, and then Corey, your response to that, that would be great.
Yes, thanks very much for this question. It's one that's near and dear to my heart, as I wrote my PhD dissertation on how countries interpret the law of the sea. China is my primary case study, and I've studied its claims in the South China Sea at length. And actually, this connects back to something that Corey said about freedom of navigation. So I'll sort of touch upon these issues as they relate to one another. I think it is important to recognize that these two issues are somewhat separate, that there are ways in which China's claims in the South China Sea to islands and resources are quite excessive, not in accordance with international law, and that that's a problem. But this is actually different from the freedom of navigation issue. China's supposed threat to freedom of navigation is actually greatly exaggerated, in my view. They've never threatened commercial navigation. They depend on that free flow of commerce more than anyone, especially in the South China Sea, but also in straits further afield. And what it really, I think, boils down to, this freedom of navigation rhetoric, is actually just military competition over the waters along China's coast. China's sense of insecurity in the face of extremely frequent US military surveillance and reconnaissance operations, around 1,500 to 2,000 per year along China's coast, which, we can only imagine how we would feel if China were doing that many surveillance operations along the coast of, California. As well as, but then there are these disputes, and the United States does a lot of freedom of navigation operations, what we call freedom of navigation operations, near these islands that are actually out of the normal sea lanes, in order to assert, our interpretation of what military vessels should be able to do at sea, even right close to other countries' shores. And so, that China disagrees with those, and that, oftentimes gets simplified into China's threatening freedom of navigation, but it's a little more complex than that. When it comes to, its interpretation of what militaries can do at sea, its interpretations are actually fairly par for the course relative to most countries in Asia in particular. They're actually less extreme than India's claims. Most of the Indian Ocean countries and in the South China Sea, most of China's neighbors also have concerns about foreign military vessels at sea, including Japan and South Korea. They impose more limits than the US views legitimate. So actually, I think that issue is not as much of a concern. I do think the concern over China's excessive claims in South China Sea is more problematic, especially from the perspective of the other claimants, right? From the perspective of the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and Indonesia, which doesn't claim the disputed islands, but there is an area of overlap in terms of what China claims in terms of resources. So this is a real problem. I think this is an area where, to Corey's point, and I didn't deny that the fact that China's behavior, in fact, I acknowledge that China's behavior does pose legitimate concerns. And I think the South China Sea is sort of a prime example of this. I think that their behavior is undermining their position in the region. But it's not black and white, right? These countries still really economically depend upon China, and they're not willing to. They don't want the United States to use the South China Sea as this wedge issue to force a zero-sum containment strategy on them. And so, I think it's a hard thing. I actually think it'd be better for the United States not to be highly involved in these disputes, to signal support for the ASEAN position that these disputes need to be resolved in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It would help if we would ratify it. I'm not holding my breath. But I think that sort of calling upon all parties to avoid escalation of disputes, affirming that we have a neutral position in the underlying disputes over the islands, even though we think that the broader claims to resources and maritime jurisdiction need to be resolved in accordance with the law of the sea. I think that the more we get involved, the more it actually causes China to double down and feel weak and feel like we are trying to tip the scales in the favor of the other claimants. And I think that there's a lot of evidence from history where China's actually compromised more in land border disputes when they're in a stronger position. It's counterintuitive, but it goes along with this mentality that they like to be the sort of generous, magnanimous power. And so, I think Xi Jinping has not given strong indications in that direction, but I think the goal should be to stabilize the disputes. And they actually are fairly stable right now, so that China will, hopefully in the future be more willing to compromise. And they've indicated that they would, and I think we should support that.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Every Asian country except China supports freedom of navigation and American freedom of navigation operations. So it's not that the United States is forcing something on countries in the region that they don't want. The reason that that China has not yet collapsed ASEAN's preference for peaceful resolution of these disputes is because the United States is protecting the international rights China signed up to under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Everybody wants us to do it, and a bunch of other countries participate in these freedom of navigation operations because they are fearful of China trying to impose its preference. Xi Jinping stood in the Rose Garden and promised President Obama that there was no threat to freedom of navigation by the artificial islands China was building in these disputed areas, and that China would not militarize those islands. And it has done so in order to pose a threat to freedom of navigation and force other countries to concede their claims in the East and South China Seas. China is the predator on these issues, and American military involvement is simply to try and ensure freedom of navigation consistent with the obligations China voluntarily accepted in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, and that every other country in Asia supports.
Thank you very much, Corey. To change channels a little bit, I have a question for Anna Ashton. Anonymous questioner, do you have any sense of how China will respond to the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act? And are the U.S.-China Business Council member companies worried?
So that's an interesting question. I mean, I think our expectation is that to the extent that we are, that we're engaging in promulgation of industrial policy, and boosting federal subsidies to particular industries, yeah, we should expect that we're going to see China respond in the same way. Why? Because China already does that in the first place. That's kind of China's model. I think our businesses would say a couple of things. Number one, we're in this interesting moment where some of the long-standing accepted rules for the best way to compete economically are being challenged from the left, from the right, from the center, and even being reconsidered in the business community, because we did have perhaps an expectation that bringing China into our system, even though China operated by very different rules, would gradually move China to adopt practices that were closer to our rules. And we haven't necessarily seen that across the board. I think we have seen it in some respects, but certainly not to the degree that anybody wanted. And there's a lot about China's system that's inefficient, but there's a lot about it that has been effective too. And we can't afford to just stand on principle, or on our commitment to a particular theory and say we shouldn't have any industrial policy or any focus of government funding on any industries. It seems appropriate that if we have particular sectors that we want to ensure are competitive into the future, that we need to find ways to go about supporting those sectors and encouraging their development. So I think our businesses would say, yeah, we're worried about China doing this, and we don't want to see our government be overzealous about the way that it is starting to do this. But that doesn't mean that it's not appropriate to do any of it. Some industrial policy, some federal funding, some focused assistance to industry is probably a good thing. I wanted to respond to some of Corey's comments, because first of all, wanted to say that we do not disagree that China's behavior is a significant driver of the US policy reaction here. Even the business community had gotten frustrated by 2016 with the pace of change in China, the pace of market opening, the pace of reform, and felt that it was appropriate for there to be a change in our approach. The community, by and large, does not agree that tariffs were the right tool, or that it was right to rely so heavily on tariffs as our main leverage for trying to get China to change its behavior. We don't feel like that was well thought out or successful, and we would take issue with some of the ways that China's IP theft and extent of it, nature of it, have been characterized. And we would also take issue with the idea that China hasn't liberalized at all, because we think that China's actually liberalized significantly, but much more that needs to be done. And it was, high time that there be a shift in the way that we try to encourage China to take those additional steps. But I don't know that we really approached China back in 2001 or prior to 2001 even, just with the generosity of vision. I think there was also some inherent selfishness involved in the way that we approached China and brought China into the system. For example, we talked about rare earths. It is dirty, mining and processing, and the outsourcing of the rare earths industry to China coincided with our own decision to tighten environmental regulations in such a way that it was extremely expensive to continue to mine and process rare earths here at home. So to some extent, we were outsourcing pollution to a country that would accept it, and it wasn't really surprising from that lens that China then exploited its power and its control over rare earths and tried to wield that as a weapon in a political disagreement with a neighbor, although it was concerning. And then I also think there was some naivety as well about with the assumptions that China would simply become more and more like us. But I also think that there has been longstanding concern about the general direction of China, not just from the defense community, from the business community as well, and whether or not our hopes or our ideal vision for how China would integrate into the existing international order would be realized or realized sufficiently. I feel like some of this is that it was event driven. It wasn't simply that Clinton and then Bush and then Obama were naive or too rosy in their prognosis of what was happening in the U.S.-China relationship. But that, I mean, I was at the Defense Department shortly after 9/11, working there as a civilian, and I remember clearly that Bush was pretty focused on China and addressing the coming China challenge before 9/11. But our attention had to shift after that. And once it shifted, we got pretty involved in some very long wars. And that I think has had a major impact on how we've been able to assess our relationship with China and how much of our resources and attention we've been able to devote to shaping that relationship in the right direction. And this rebalancing of our attention from a relationship driven probably too much by commercial concerns to one that is now more heavily influenced by national security concerns isn't because of a sudden awakening to the fact that there are national security concerns in the relationships and fundamental differences in our ideology and our goals and our interests, but more of a reassessment of how to prioritize each side of these things as China has become powerful enough that the knowledge that its goals, interests, and ambitions may be somewhat different from ours is no longer overshadowed by the fact that it can't actually achieve those goals, interests, and ambitions. Now it's beginning to look like they can. But I think China watchers have always been aware that this is an issue. I think national security experts have always been aware that this is an issue. And yes, Xi Jinping infuses more anxiety-provoking rhetoric and posturing into the equation, but fundamentally, I don't actually think that this is a change.
Thank you very much, Anna. There were quite a few other questions. I'm going to go directly to one that I think will get us back on the controversy track, because I think we're getting too close to consensus there. This comes from my colleague at National War College, Professor Kelly Ward. Have the United States and our allies woken up to the China threat too late? China has been playing economic hardball for 50 years, and we've been playing tiddlywinks and think we're getting tough by changing the game to badminton. China has a ruthless strategy to become a world hegemon through economic power and high technology leadership. Is the US too late to maintain pace with China economically and technologically? Who'd like to take a first shot at that? Go ahead, Dr. Schake.
I would be delighted to take a shot at that. No, I don't think we are too late. For me, the biggest surprise has been what has driven this shift in Chinese attitudes in ways that have activated the antibodies against their further rise, right? Like what I would be worried about if I were China's national security advisor is why didn't we wait until we were dominant in artificial intelligence before provoking a backlash against it? Why awaken the concerns of Europeans about China's intentions before you actually had the ability to carry them out? So the first thing is, I think China's actions are going to prevent its continued success. Anna is absolutely right that China did, especially economically, go through a lot of liberalization, but that stopped about 4 years ago. What I would be worried about if I was China's national security advisor is that the reflexes of an authoritarian society's insecurity, the need to start rounding up Jack Ma and the CEO of Ant because of their criticisms of the government, is going to create a business climate where people are going to emigrate. People aren't going to want to do business in China. I would be worried that that China is going to grow old before it grows prosperous. And remember, for all of the excitement about the magnitude of China's economy, its per capita GDP is equivalent to Mexico or Mozambique. And they have now made a series of international decisions, the whole wolf warrior craziness, and behaviors that have alerted and alarmed quite a large number of countries, and that's actually going to be the end of China's success story. If you look at the work of Michael Beckley or Derek Scissors, two of my AEI colleagues, they both think that we should be more worried about a failing China than a succeeding China, because the early indicators of that are already evident.
Thank you very much. I am going to go to another question just so we can address as many of these as possible. This one from Professor Rich Andres, also of National War College. One concern often expressed in Washington is that China spends a good deal of money attempting to buy off US-China experts with grants, paid trips to China, and other gifts, while penalizing US experts who speak out against the Communist Party policy by denying them visas and through other methods. How much do policies like this affect our ability to have a fair and unbiased debate? That's from Rich Andres, National War College. Wait, Corey, you had the last one. I'm going to hand this one over to Rachel. Do you care to answer that?
Yeah, happy to. So I do think that, there's a really vital importance that, people working on China policy, as well as, other areas of foreign policy with other countries, be really transparent about conflicts of interest, sources of funding. And, I've always gotten advice from, my mentors in the field, which includes some prominent China experts, to not accept funding from, PRC sources, even in-kind travel funding. So, I never have. And I think that this concern is probably somewhat overstated. I mean, it's not, I think in the past, before this really intense strategic competition environment emerged, it was probably more common. I personally don't think that probably has had a dispositive influence in shape, in preventing these people from, stating their clear views. But I think the structural point about the fact that, the CCP or, the PRC does use visa policy to impose restrictions on scholars that are critical of China is undeniable. Historically, I would say on that regard, they've mostly focused on scholars that are critical of China's domestic policy, its domestic repression, especially of ethnic minorities or things like that. Usually operating more in the international relations foreign policy space, there wasn't too much of a concern, although of course that sort of changed when China detained the two Michaels from Canada, when when Canada detained the Meng Wanzhou of Huawei at the U.S. request. So, and that was right before I went to China for my dissertation fieldwork. It was a nerve-wracking time. Although it was interesting when I was there and interviewing Chinese scholars who felt the same about traveling to the United States. And I think that the reality is that a lot of these people-to-people exchanges, there's been a chilling effect on both sides in recent years, and I don't think that's constructive. I do think it harms our ability to have a fully informed debate about China policy. I think that the United States should re-engage with China to try to negotiate a sort of, ratcheting down of these restrictions on people-to-people exchanges. I mean, a lot of this in recent years has come from the US. I mean, last year, the United States, severed a lot of these people-to-people programs that were funded by the US government to prevent some of those conflict of interest problems. And we severed those connections. We got rid of the Peace Corps, the Fulbright programs in China. We banned visas for all Chinese Communist Party members and their families, which by some estimates affects about a fourth of the Chinese population. And not to mention a lot of restrictions on Chinese students. So I think these just harm our ability to understand what's happening in China. In some ways, it's an overly self-defeating policy, because there is somewhat less visibility into China, given the censorship in the media environment in China. So we really need those direct exchanges, and we need the United States to be funding more of them, so that there isn't that potential conflict of interest.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Anna, can I ask you, does China attempt to buy the business community in the same way?
I mean, I think that there's plenty of evidence out there that supports that conclusion. I also think that it is often characterized in ways that are overly simplistic or unbalanced or just simply ill-informed. The phenomenon of pressure on American companies to be the standard bearers for US values and for US priorities is a really interesting one right now. I think, first of all, the US business community has a long history of being a standard bearer for a variety of different US values and norms when it comes to labor practices and environmental standards and many other aspects of operating, manufacturing, and other facilities here and abroad. And it's a good overall. It's a good record. And certainly, our companies are far more responsible and better policed than some of the alternative companies that would fill in the gaps were we to suddenly abandon China or other markets in the world where problems arise. There's a long track record of business working with NGOs and other governments to address various concerns, whether they're human rights or other, environmental in markets around the world, and doing so successfully. There are factors that raise questions about whether or not those same ways of addressing these kinds of concerns are going to be effective in the China market or can be relied upon in the China market. And I don't know the answer to that. But, I think that Corey made an interesting statement when she talked about the fact that the Chinese people may not themselves want a more liberal government. And Rachel has just expounded on why we don't really know for sure what the Chinese people want, which puts American companies in an even trickier position when operating in an environment where there's political pressure for them to preach a certain ideology in another country's market. We need to have more transparency in order to better understand exactly what the Chinese people want and how primed they are for it. We need to have more scholarly exchanges, and we need to have more reporters on the ground. And we need to be pressuring for China to open its doors wider. And we probably need to roll back some of the policies that Rachel just detailed that have closed our doors. But at the end of the day, the Chinese government's relationship to the Chinese people is a social contract, even if it's not the same one that we have. And they do have domestic drivers that probably are factoring into some of their overplaying their hand and being too aggressive in their positioning of themselves on the world stage. And right now, we're in a place where we really can't assess exactly what the state of that social contract is, or what the opportunity is for us to influence the direction of that social contract's future. But I think we do have to think really hard about what are our goals and what's the best strategy for getting to our goals. Yes, but first and foremost, what are our goals in this relationship? What does winning look like here? What is success? How do we define it? Because I think that there's a lot of talk on the Hill and among other policymakers about, this distinction between the CCP and the Chinese people. And I understand why there's a desire to draw that distinction, but we don't know the extent to which that distinction is really felt on the ground in China. And I think that the focus on that distinction is also encouraging policymakers to think along the lines of how to undermine the CCP itself, and how to, work towards a China that has a more liberal government that we can work with more effectively. But there may be huge blowback to moving in that direction that doesn't serve our interests at all.
Anna, if you don't mind, I'm going to go over to ask Corey for her comment, because I know she has to leave in 3 minutes.
Thank you for that gracious That's my friend. I agree with Anna that we don't know what the Chinese people think, but I would put more emphasis than I think she does that we don't know what they think because they live in a repressive society. There's not a free media. People are penalized for expressing their views. And so she's absolutely right that we shouldn't assume that they share our values, but we also shouldn't assume that they support the government's choices because they don't have the freedom to express it without penalty.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of the session. I'm sorry to all of those who all those questions that I didn't get to. I just want to end the session with a question that an African colleague posed to me recently privately. He said, if you were an African leader and you look over the last 20 years, which government do you think has done better providing for the interests of the majority of its people? The government of the United States or the government of the People's Republic of China? This is coming from an African colleague, and it's a very when you parse out the question, it's very provocative. It's potentially a subject for a lot of controversy. Let me thank you all, Corey, Anna, Rachel, very much for your insights today, for helping educate us. I'd like to thank the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment and, as always, the leadership of National Defense University for allowing us and enabling us to succeed. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you on our next session of the speaker series. Michael McCloskey from National Defense University, over and out.